Canada is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, especially in being water-rich. The province of Ontario shares the Great Lakes, which contain 18% of the world's fresh surface water, with the United States. Access to sufficient, affordable, and safe drinking water and adequate sanitation is easy for most Canadians. But this is not true for many Indigenous people. Sadly, the water supply to many Indigenous communities on reserves is contaminated, hard to access, or at risk due to faulty treatment systems. The government regulates water quality for off-reserve communities, but has no binding regulations for water on First Nation reserves. There are articles upon articles about the water crisis that Indigenous people are facing. On March 22nd, the most recent news of water advisories towards the Indigenous community came out. For those of you who aren't aware of the water crisis that Indigenous people are facing, then don't worry, because today I'll be explaining all of that. So, hold up. You may be wondering, what exactly are water advisories? Basically, they are preventative measures issued by the government to warn people not to drink the water in their community. And usually, the people that are receiving these advisories are Indigenous individuals. Shocking, right? There are different types of water advisories that are sent out, depending on the danger and the level of contamination. Most Indigenous communities are on boil water advisories, since boiling is effective for removing bacteria, viruses, and parasites, but it's not good for removing toxic metals. Emergency advisories are issued when there is a confirmed water quality risk, and precautionary advisories signal a technical problem that could make the water unsafe. Both cause socioeconomic disruptions. But I'll explain the impact of the water crisis later in this presentation. Since 1995, and even before that actually, Indigenous individuals have been forced to live under many water advisories. Back in 2015, when Trudeau was campaigning, he recognized the ongoing water crisis that Indigenous people are facing, which is essentially the lack of clean water they have access to. He promised that by March 2021, this crisis would be resolved, and he released his full package of campaign promises, which was an 88-page plan that includes billions pledged for infrastructure projects, including investments in water facilities, as well as a commitment to First Nations education of $750 million per year. Recently, more than 250 members of the Niskanda First Nation were evacuated to Thunder Bay after an oily sheen was found on their reservoir. This left that community without access to running water, and Niskanda has been living under a boil water advisory for more than 26 years. They have fought for their right for clean water, and the recent evacuation has brought attention to the promise that was made in 2015 by the federal government, where Trudeau claimed to end all on-reserve long-term drinking water advisories. However, as of right now, there are 61 long-term drinking water advisories in place in First Nations communities located south of 63 degrees north. So, we can add another broken and unfulfilled promise from the government to our list. The Liberal government originally stated, again in December 2015, that the community would get a new treatment plant up and running by the spring of 2018. A string of construction delays and equipment failures pushed the new date to March 2019, but work is still ongoing. Now we're at the end of March 2021, and as we can see, Trudeau's promise has been unfulfilled. The Prime Minister said his government has lifted 95 drinking water advisories since 2015, but the Indigenous Service Canada website says 61 advisories remain. Trudeau stated that, "We recognize there's a lot more to do, but travel restrictions related to COVID-19 have made it more difficult in certain situations, but we continue to work very closely with communities across the country." However, the auditor's review of the First Nations drinking water crisis found that COVID-19 pushed the timeline back on some water projects, but Indigenous Service Canada was already behind schedule by the end of March 2020. Before the pandemic hit, the audit has also found Indigenous Service Canada's efforts to lift boil water advisories to have been constrained by a funding policy that hasn't been updated in 30 years, and by the lack of regulatory regime that includes legal protections comparable with other communities in Canada. In this course, we have talked about the impact of colonialism, genocide, the UN, human rights, bias in media, and the conflicts in the 21st century. Specifically in regards to the impact of colonialism, obviously for Indigenous people, colonialism has only brought upon negatives. Canada's colonialism towards the Indigenous community in the past has led to culture alienation, territorial dispossession, intergenerational trauma, systemic discrimination, and socioeconomic marginalization, which all have had negative impacts on the lives of many Indigenous people today. One of them being the issue we are talking about today, which is the ongoing water crisis that Indigenous people are facing currently. So, as we can see, intergenerational trauma has had a detrimental effect towards the Indigenous community, as it was an after effect from colonialism. Colonialism is the reason that Indigenous individuals went through genocide, since it was Canada's colonization that forced these people to assimilate by implementing residential schools, the 60 scoop, etc. The individuals that went through that historical trauma never fully recovered from it, and the government has barely provided any support, so they are now facing issues like this water crisis, a greater representation in the criminal justice system, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and many more. The government's constant neglect for Indigenous intergenerational trauma is continuing the legacy of colonialism by ignoring the ongoing poverty, racism, social inclusion, and substandard housing, and economic marginalization of Indigenous people. Genocide includes killing or causing serious bodily or mental harm with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, and can also mean forcibly transferring children of a group to another group. Canada is undergoing a massive genocide today against their Indigenous population, even though they were one of the original members of the UN that ratified the Genocide Convention and one of the countries that is water-rich. What is ironic is that the government of Canada is providing other countries with resources and support for clean water and sanitation. However, they have failed to help the citizens residing in their own country. Not only that, but having access to clean water is a basic human right worldwide. It is the fact that you cannot survive without clean, drinkable water. As leaders of this country, Canada is responsible for providing all of its citizens this basic human necessity. Yet that isn't happening. Instead, Indigenous people are going through a genocide and no one is doing anything about it, not even the UN. Other government leaders have also acknowledged this issue and are criticizing Trudeau's response and failure to keep his promises. Government success isn't measured by funding announcements, it's measured by outcomes, said Conservative MP Gary Vindel. The Liberals like to make eye-catching promises in order to win elections, but their consistent failure to deliver on these promises is undermining trust and hurting reconciliation. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says that Indigenous communities are no better off now after 6 years of the Liberals being in government. And a 2014 UN report described the water situation in First Nation reserves as troubling, with more than half of the water systems posing medium or high health risk. On the other hand, non-Indigenous communities in Canada have nowhere near this level of risk, whilst everyone else continues to have the luxury to ignore or criticize each other regarding this issue. More and more Indigenous lives are in risk as each day passes by. So here are some additional questions and information that you need to understand the situation better. First question, what is the impact of the water crisis? Second question is, why does the problem continue to persist? And the third question is, what can the Canadian government do to help? What can we as individuals do? So let's start off answering the question, what is the impact of the water crisis? And we're going to watch a video on the impact of the water crisis on Indigenous families. So I'm going to start that now.
We've been on the bottled water for 19 years now, and a lot of our kids grew up on that. My son Adam, he's 14 years old now, but he's had eczema since he's been an infant. These are some of the scars he has from that eczema on his he's infected again. When I first started taking him to the doctor, they would give him all kinds of medication, and I would continually bathe him in that water. But after a while, I noticed that he was getting infections all the time, and I would continually be at the doctor's office. And finally, one day when I took him in, he asked me, he said, is your water treated at home? And I said, no. And I told him, I said that our water comes directly from the lake, I said, into our homes, and that we don't have a treatment plant. He said, there's your problem. He said, it's your water. He said, that's why your boy keeps getting these infections.
This is how we turn on and off the water. This is what me and my children bathe in.
Okay, on to the second question. Why does this problem continue to persist? So, the drinking water crisis on reserves can be resolved, yet it's persisted for decades. Canada has frequently acknowledged its many challenges in addressing the problem. Since 1977, the federal government has investigated, made recommendations, and committed funds to remediate the water and wastewater situations on the reserves. Yet the problem still remains. In fact, the government's own audits show a pattern of overpromising and underperforming occurring. Clearly, investments of billions of dollars over decades have not helped Indigenous people living on reserves. So, why is this? A primary reason is because of the legal discrimination that exists related to the regulation and protection of drinking water for First Nations reserves. Provincial and territorial regulations governing safe drinking water and sanitation, which operate to protect the health of most Canadian residents, do not extend to First Nations reserves. Systems have been designed, constructed, and operated on reserves without the kind of legal standards and protections that the government has adopted for all other Canadians. This disparate system of regulations has led to disparate outcomes in access to safe drinking water and sanitation. Also, the Constitution Act, which was established in 1867, granted the federal government jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. So the deferral government is directly responsible for governing most aspects of life on reserve. As we know, from this, the Canadian Parliament first passed the Indian Act in 1876, which has been amended many times because of its legal discrimination, but it still remains today. We learned about this in the course. First Nations chiefs and councils are accountable to members on reserve for providing services including owning and operating water and wastewater systems on reserve. Their power to govern, however, is significantly limited by the far-reaching role of the federal government instituted by the equated and discriminatory Indian Act. Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, so INAC is the federal government with jurisdiction over reserves, has authority over water and wastewater on reserves. INAC faces a number of funding constraints, including a 20-year-old arbitrary cap on base funding growth. Between 1996 and 2015, INAC's base budget was limited to an annual 2% increase, regardless of population growth, inflation, or need. INAC has consistently struggled to spend budgeted funds, meaning that in many years, tens of millions of promised dollars for First Nations have gone unspent. Of course, problems are expected, but INAC's lapses were so significant and they were not publicly explained. In addition to this, there are other challenges. So, besides just like the regulatory and funding problems, lack of source water protections and government support for private water and wastewater system contributes to the crisis. So, how can we help, or how can the government of Canada help? So, 27 days ago, an anthropology professor at McMaster University answered questions regarding Canada's water crisis and explained what the Canadian government should be doing. She said that strategic planning is needed from the government, and they should work with Indigenous people to determine an effective, long-term, sustainable solution, instead of just throwing money at the problem or rushing in and forcing First Nations people to engage with people who aren't interested in helping them. Proper infrastructure is needed, and that includes waste treatment, not just water treatment. And there needs to be more funding and proper regulations. So, what can we do as individuals to help? Well, the first thing we need to do is educate ourselves. And since you guys are doing that right now, we can move on to the next step, which is spreading awareness. We should post about this issue all over social media and highlight and support Indigenous voices. They need clean water, and they need it now. So spread awareness, sign petitions, and maybe even write letters to the government about your concern over this issue. One resource that you can use is Amnesty International, which is an organization that provides resources for us to protest. So you can get involved, you can donate, you can sign petitions. This website, this organization, provides you all the resources that you need. So yeah, you can write letters to the Canadian government regarding this issue, and you can write to other leaders about other issues that you want to help out with. Use your voice for change. Personally, I stand with the Indigenous people in support. I believe that this is an issue where immediate action needs to be taken, and I find it incredibly sad that some people have grown up without having clean water. As someone privileged with clean water, this issue has no direct impact on me. However, having clean water is a basic necessity, and I want to help the Indigenous community the best way that I can. So yeah, those are my personal thoughts, and thank you for listening to this presentation. These are my sources.